Hey, social work students, how are you? Wow, final week of the semester. It's been crazy. I hope you've enjoyed this class. It's one of my favorites. I really enjoy teaching it, and I hope you've learned a lot. Policy and history is so important, and it's going to help you become a better social worker to really understand everything that you've learned this semester. Let's talk about the topics for this, your final week, week 16. We're going to be talking about the elderly as well as working Americans. And so we're on chapters 14 and 15 of your textbook. Let's start out by talking about older adults. So we've mentioned what we call the silver tsunami, and I really love that term because it really illustrates those two words, silver tsunami, illustrate what's happening in our culture in terms of an aging population. So we have this wave of individuals, a larger percentage of elderly people than ever in the history of our nation, is what that silver tsunami is all about. And so understanding it as social workers is going to be really important. Understanding the elderly population, what motivates them, what it means to get old, and what are some of the different definitions of elderly. So let's talk a little bit about old age as a social construct. So when you think of elderly people, I know a lot of you think of people who are very limited in their skill set. And there's a lot of myths about older Americans and what they're capable of doing and what they're not capable of. And so I hope we'll debunk some of those myths today. So eligibility in a lot of programs happen at around 62 or 65. The Older Americans Act has eligibility at 60. Medicare eligibility is at 65. You can get an AARP membership at age 50. And you can get discounts at restaurants. I turned 55 this year. I don't feel that old, but I am. We have a few different definitions in terms of social constructs for the elderly. We call the young old anybody between 65 and 75. Did you know that's called the young old? And then the old is anybody over 75. It's been really interesting. The oldest old is, of course, people over 80. But it's been really interesting with the Corona crisis, how elderly people have been even more defined, because the older you are, of course, the more chances you could die of coronavirus. And so you're at a higher risk by your age. I have an elderly aunt and uncle in their 80s. My mother-in-law is in her 80s. And so, we've all been very careful with them. And it's kind of crazy how these are people who need social connection more than ever, yet they're denied it because of the dangers, the obvious health dangers that could happen. And so really interesting how policies and attitudes changed immediately because of coronavirus. So let's go back and look at some of the history of our attitudes, our social construct in terms of the elderly people throughout history. So, of course, early on in colonial America, it was very rare for individuals to achieve an old age. I mean, the average most people died in their 50s or 60s. And so the old were kind of unheard of. And of course, in different cultures, we have different values related to old age. Among Native Americans, of course, the elderly are valued for their wisdom, but there's also in many Native American tribes, historically, there's been an attitude of when someone is no longer capable of contributing to the culture, they would wander off. A lot of among the Inuits, among the Alaskan natives, they would literally get on an iceberg and float off, and that was a common form of suicide by elderly Native Alaskans. And so this has been something that it's just very interesting. Of course, we value in every culture, we value the wisdom of elderly, but it seems to be more more valued in some cultures than others. Among African Americans, elderly people are valued. Among the European immigrants, they have been kind of both, kind of a little bit of both. And so it's interesting to look at how historically our attitudes have been towards these individuals. There's been some shifting in attitudes towards old age in America. So as a group, we have become more negative. The possible causes of more of a negative attitude toward elderly includes industrialization. Why? Because the emphasis is on speed, being able, a skill set that includes attributes that come from young people, not elderly people. So experience is not as valued in an industrialized society. After the War of Independence, so there was a rejection of traditional ideas, and so elderly people were possibly not as valued because of that. A few other causes might include the accumulation of wealth. The more wealthy you are as a young person, the less likely you have need of elderly people who are not wealthy. And the reversal can be true when you have elderly relatives who are wealthy. Maybe you have more respect for them, right? Medical knowledge. Of course, as we age, we have an increased medical problems. The diseases that come with age are obviously make individuals weaker, and so they're not perceived as having as much value. According to your family configuration, a lot of the times older women who don't seem to have a function, if once children have grown and these women don't have a career or that kind of thing, they can be deemed as having less value in their elderly years. What's interesting is, I know a lot of you have seen this in your own personal and professional experience. A lot of elderly women seem to be some of the best caregivers and caretakers of young children. And it's kind of interesting. When I was a young mother, my mom was in the final stages of Alzheimer's. So I was running a daycare in my home. My sister was in nursing school. She'd drop her kids and my mom off at my house every day. And I was to care for everybody. But what was interesting is my mother would take over the little children, and even though she had some Alzheimer's going on, it seemed like she related to the little ones. And I often joked that they spoke the same language. They were at the same maturity level. Mom was losing it while they were gaining it. And so I think there's a lot of wonderful opportunities out there as social workers where we can combine the strengths of elderly and young. One of the things that I did as a school counselor, and I think I've shared this with many of you, but I'm going to share it again. One of the things that I did was made sure that the school that I worked for, and I took part in helping the kindergartners go visit the nursing home. And we would do that for Mother's Day and Grandparents' Day and Christmas, and would sing to the elderly people in the nursing home. And it was beautiful for everybody. The elderly people loved watching the little children, and a lot of those little 5-year-olds didn't have access to their own grandparents. And so you could see kind of this mutual appreciation going on. It was wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about where some of the programs and policies come from in terms of the elderly. So elderly were separated initially from the redeemable poor. Let's think back to the old Elizabethan poor laws. They were separated and they were considered to be permanently dependent. And so it was perhaps a little bit easier for them to receive services under Elizabethan poor laws. Informal assistance among African Americans, we saw the emergence of the benevolent societies, and this was a lot because of elderly people needing to have some services as well. Because of public pensions for veterans, we saw a complexity of administration on basis of disability that led to the use of age as a proxy. Some of the attitudes that we have in modern day, sometimes we might use the aged ideas as a scapegoat. What do we think of when we hear the term productive aging? These are vital individuals who are eager for meaningful involvement. So the older you get, it doesn't take away from your experience, or I mean, memory loss is common for a lot of elderly people. However, the experience that you have, the education that you have doesn't go away with aging. And a lot of older people want to be involved and have meaning and purpose in their lives. It's really interesting. One study showed that of physicians that retired, a physician, once they retired, was more likely to go down physically and mentally than if they kept working. I've known a lot of doctors that have worked well into their 70s. My husband even mentioned he has a doctor friend who's working in his 80s and still very vital and providing a much needed service. And so it's not always necessarily true that old people are decrepit and need to be cared for. Let's talk a little bit about some of the economic realities and demographics of the United States. We talk about the silver tsunami. We also talk about the graying of America. So 4% of the U.S. population at the beginning of the 20th century was considered elderly. By the year 2000, it was 12%. And it will be even more. There's more diversity. There's more people of color and women who are over age 75 than ever before. Poverty in later life, we know that poverty increases with age. It's just a fact. And what's interesting is women are more likely to outlive men, but they also have a higher risk of poverty. People of color experience higher rates of poverty in later years, and the Social Security in 2014 was a major source of income for about 64% of older Americans. And so you might think of Social Security as a supplement, but for some people it was considered more their income than not. Let's talk a little bit about the participation of people over the age of 60 in taking part of some of the programs that we have out there. Some of the services that people over 60 need include transportation, outreach, information, and referral services. So the Older Americans Act has helped support these services, and also health, mental health, legal assistance, and anything else that's necessary for the general welfare of older people. Nutrition services have often been important as well. Congregate and home delivered meals have been a part of the OAA. There's been tensions around the Older Americans Act, scarce funding, universal eligibility. I'm interested to see how these policies are going to evolve as a result of COVID-19. In 1987, there was a preference for greatest economic or social need with particular attention to low-income minority individuals. Very, very important. Some of the public policies and private pensions, some of the programs and policies that we've seen. In the 40s and 50s, there was a growth in pensions due to public policies. So there were wage and price controls in place. In 1974, we had the pension reforms, and this was a result of several problems with private pensions. Please go over some of these different policy changes that you'll see in your textbook. One of the more important ones that you'll need to know about is how the Medicare Catastrophic Coverage Act of 1988 required Medicaid. This allowed spouses to retain income up to 150% of federal property level and some assets. And it rationed health care by age, withholding medical care except the natural life course. So understand how these work together, how end-of-life care what your textbook says about that. Medicare covers some hospice care, and learn a little bit about the Patient Self-Determination Act and how that has an impact on social workers. You need to know what a living will is, what an advanced medical directive is. You'll need to learn a little bit about what assisted suicide is, whether you agree with it or not. It's a good thing to learn about and understand. So, social work with older adults, growing demand, limited supply. It's not offered often as a specialty. I know there are classes taught at UNR, but I don't believe they offer it yet as a specialty there. A lot of students aren't necessarily interested in it, but for the students who are, this can be sometimes a fairly lucrative area of social work. There's a great need for it. So I've heard that some social workers have really been able to kind of write their own ticket in terms of jobs available for people who are willing to work with the elderly. Learn all of the different acts that came about. Be fairly familiar with those, and understand what it means to be a geriatric social worker, so that you can do well on the test this week. All right, let's talk a little bit about. Hold on, just a sec. Sorry, you get a nice view of my desk while I switch PowerPoints here. All right, let's talk a little bit about working Americans and how working Americans, what does that have to do with social work? What do you need to know about different labor laws, workers' rights, and so forth? All right. The Wagner Act in 1935, we also called this the National Labor Relations Act. This was an important labor act, probably the most important labor act in U.S. history. It established workers' rights to organize and negotiate with management. Before this act, we had a lot of women and children, in the workplace. And after, we were able to establish more social and economic changes. And the migration, what brought this about? The migration of Southern agricultural workers to the northern cities. When you think about cultural evolution, and this is a term all of you should be very well acquainted with, cultural evolution is when an entire culture evolves and changes because of needs that individuals have. So post-Civil War, we had a lot of individuals living in the South. Now, before the Civil War, of course, cotton was king, but and of course, slavery was a reality. And after the Civil War, things changed for a lot of people, and they didn't have the same means of making an income. So this is when growth to a lot of more urban areas, a lot of African Americans who had previously been slaves moved to urban areas where they knew that work would be easier to come by. And a lot of these northern cities like Detroit and Chicago began to have huge African American communities, and there was organizing experiences. Union members, unions were put together because of these huge groups of people. We had the civil rights movement happening, and something called affirmative action happened. There was an executive order. Firms were doing business with the federal government, had to take affirmative action to ensure that there was no discrimination. Affirmative action today is considered controversial in some among many groups of people. And when I lived in East Cleveland, it was interesting. I had several African American friends, really good friends, and one in particular was a young mother with 3 little children, and she was accepted into medical school partly because of affirmative action. Now, at the time, there were a lot of qualified white males who weren't accepted, and she was accepted because of affirmative action. Some of my friends didn't think it was fair, but if you knew this young mother and how hard she was working to provide for a family, what I saw was in many ways a very positive thing, because it gave her an opportunity perhaps she wouldn't have had otherwise. And this was an individual who could bring back to her community medical care, as well as being able to provide for her little family. And so there's both sides. And then I've also spoke to African Americans who do not believe that affirmative action is an appropriate action to take, because they have felt like it lessens the value of the award. So if you're if the standard for an African American female to get into medical school is here, and for a white male to get in is here, then she isn't achieving as much, and it doesn't matter as much. There's different arguments, and you need to study it and figure out for yourself what you think. So there were presidential orders governing federal contracts that increased the employment opportunities for people of color. There's some people that say it's gone on too long. I don't know. It depends on who you talk to. Let's talk a little bit about immigration policies and the influence on the American workers, how the immigration policies have influenced American workers. Let's talk about undocumented immigration. This seems to be a huge topic. Immigration reform has also been a very big topic as of late. What do you think of it? You need to decide, and you need to figure out what you think. Of course, social workers need to be there for people who don't have a voice. At the same time, are there people in power who are pushing for groups of immigrants and groups of illegals to have more rights because they'll provide the voting that people in power want? You have to take a look at all sides and understand it for yourself. Let's talk a little bit about women and children in the workplace. So traditionally, women have been paid less than men for the same job. I believe it's 70% less. I'm sorry, they make 70 cents for every dollar a man makes. So protective labor laws for working girls were concerned that women were replacing men. So there were limited number of hours that women could work, and the wages were regulated. What happened as a result of the New Deal? Women were excluded from the New Deal legislation. Policies and attitudes toward working women changed with World War II and the demand for labor. Working women and the Great Society. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination based on gender. So that's definitely, on the books. It's illegal to discriminate against women. Of course, it still occurs, and I've sure seen a lot of it in rural Nevada. Child labor. In 1900, there were 2 million children working in factories and mines. Can you imagine? The early focus of the Children's Bureau was to crack down on child labor. The Supreme Court rulings derailed the attempts to reform child labor practices for nearly 2 decades. It really took some fighting. Finally, in 1941, the Supreme Court upheld child labor law of Fair Labor Standards Act. So, become familiar with some of the following terms. You need to understand what alliance with labor unions and movements is about, what advocacy in the labor movement, what empowerment, what social justice, what these had to do with the labor movement. Understand some of the contemporary realities in terms of working Americans. What is work as an anti-poverty strategy? How does work happen as an anti-poverty strategy? Inequality and U.S. workers. How do we see that? How do we continue to see that? And how can we combat it as social workers? Unemployment in the United States. What can social workers do to help with that? what are some of the health insurance, some of the benefits that workers should insist on and should be that should be a right. Understand some of the different acts that have occurred, including child labor laws, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and Age Discrimination in an Unemployment Act. This is a really, really good chapter in your book. It's going to help you a lot. Many of you will become familiar with because you'll become familiar with these laws and be interested in them. You might be more interested in forensic social work, working within the legal environment and helping individuals that need that kind of help. I had a wonderful time teaching court-ordered domestic violence classes and found that there was a lot of these policies that it was good that I was familiar with in helping individuals. So I hope you've enjoyed this class. I really enjoyed teaching it. If you have any questions or comments about this last week, any of the assignments that you need to get in, remember that you do have a final, even though I have eliminated the penalties for late work, you do have to get it in. If you want a good grade out of this class, you need to have everything in no later than the 15th of May. Earlier is better because I need to get it all graded. So thank you so much for being good students. I hope you've learned a lot and it's been a joy to teach you, and I will see you in 300 level classes.